And we're back. So now we're going to talk about general principles of corporate social responsibility. And there's a variety of them. These are very broad principles. And the interpretation becomes a little bit difficult, as we're going to see as this lecture progresses. But generally speaking, a manager should respect and make a legitimate effort to meet the needs of multiple stakeholders. Now, what in the world does that mean? To make an effort, a legitimate effort to respect stakeholders. Well, you know that suppliers, customers, and stockholders all may have very different needs, demands, and wants. So obviously you're going to make choices and somebody is not going to have everything that they want. So this is kind of a gray area. Corporate behavior must comply with an underlying social contract. Corporate behavior must in some way be legitimate. And of course, corporations should be transparent and accountable. I mean, what in the world does that mean, right? I mean, you think about it, a corporation pursues competitive advantage, and yet imitation is one of the best ways to erode competitive advantage. So if you're too transparent, you also can lose competitive advantage due to imitation from competitors. Again, being accountable, that also raises all sorts of questions. Well, accountable to who? Are you most accountable to your customers, to your stockholders, to the government? Who? Okay? So these principles are very, very vague. I want you to remember that. And because of this ambiguity, it's very hard to navigate corporate social responsibility. There's no right or wrong answer here. Remember that. Now, a recent review over the past 30 years found that most corporations generally seem to have a positive correlation between social responsibility and profits. Now, does that necessarily mean that corporations that are responsible are therefore more profitable? No, probably not. What it probably means is that you can manage your funds and your business more effectively, and therefore, because you can manage to have leftover money, you're probably running a very efficient operation in many other ways, and therefore responsibility is possible. That would be my interpretation of it. So needless to say, corporations, we think that are socially responsible are probably not less profitable than similar firms. Again, if you can manage to have leftover money at the end of the year for corporate social responsibility projects, you're probably doing something right anyhow. Generally speaking, industrialized nations, particularly in the West, corporate social responsibility is beginning to be a more accepted doctrine. And this has, of course, led to debates in the duties of corporations in their international operations. And the reason being that international law is weak in addressing social impacts on businesses. Furthermore, a big part of corporate social responsibility is showing off what you do to domestic customers so that they kind of have some faith in you. What goes on internationally in a foreign country may be less visible to your customers. And I think that's another reason why social responsibility has some issues internationally. Not just because international law is weak in addressing the social impacts of businesses. Of course, we know that the largest corporations may not be subject to strong laws and regulations in foreign countries. Foreign countries, foreign governments, and officials may be willing to turn a blind eye to companies that break the law within their borders for a variety of reasons, including corruption, which we'll talk about a little bit later during this course. Corporations, of course, have also used different strategies to distance themselves from direct accountability or social harms. Think about all these companies like, well, I probably shouldn't name any, but we can talk about that in class. But many companies use subcontractors to do a lot of the dirty work. And so subcontractors are usually local firms, and they're the ones that engage in unethical behavior. So when it falls back on the large corporations, say, hey, that wasn't us that did that. It was a subcontractor, and we're not responsible for their actions. So that's kind of a way around it. We'll talk more about that in class. And, of course, just because you regulate corporate social responsibility more nationally, so if a U.S. company is subjected to more U.S. laws, that doesn't necessarily translate into more socially responsible behavior overseas. Now, in theory, you have this idea of extraterritoriality, and that's the application of one nation's laws within the borders of another nation. So it's basically when a U.S. company, for example, goes overseas and operates, then they are actually imposing U.S. law on their host country and they're abiding by U.S. law at the same time. There's all sorts of problems with that we'll discuss in the actual lecture. Now, there's also a dichotomy when it comes to international corporate social responsibility between soft law and hard law. Okay? Hard law is something that you can read in a document, like a legal document. It says you will do this, this, and this. These are the consequences, X, Y, and Z. Very black and white. You either obey the law or you don't. It's pretty straightforward. Where you start getting into a gray area is what we call soft law. And these are kind of statements of philosophy, policy, and principle. Things like, we will behave legitimate. Think of those general principles of corporate social responsibility that we already talked about. Think about how vague and ambiguous they are. Okay? That's when you start getting into problems with soft law. Okay. So we will wrap up this portion of the lecture, and our next portion we'll start talking about kind of the global CSR spectrum.